and I ended up going back out there last evening and expected the typical evening die down in the winds and reduction in thermal activity, and I blasted off, and I just nicely got airborne, and a very benign frontal system really associated with this line of clouds changed the wind direction at the field by 110 degrees. So here I had thought that through the day the winds were out of the west almost all day long. I thought that that was going to continue into the evening hours, and end up getting airborne, and darn wind switches 110 degrees. So it was a little bit bumpy. So because of the turbulence associated with the change in the wind direction, I decided to scrap my plans to go up higher and do steeper turns and so on. And I just enjoyed flying around for the evening. It was absolutely beautiful, except it was bumpy. So I'm trying to get a feel for how much brakes to release when the wing falls back behind me, and how much to dampen as it's surging forward in the bumps and the turbulence. Rode through some of the thermals, and the problem that I had was that I now needed to land in a totally different direction than I'd taken off from, and it was towards the tallest trees associated with this property. And I knew that the wind would be burbling over the tops of those trees, so I wanted to make my approach to the very northernmost portion of the field, and that included flying over some power lines and over a peach orchard. And although it was beautiful, it was a little bit intimidating. And one of the other things that I learned was that the glide ratio into the wind is not quite as far as I'd thought it was. So I underestimated the altitude that I wanted to start the approach at. I really did want to make a power-off approach, but I was also concerned about getting on the ground because I had suspicions that the winds would increase with the advancing frontal system. That's not really what happened, but I was happy to be back on the ground and happy to make a landing, although 3 steps into the high grass and I ended up setting down after I touched down. Now here you can see that I've lined up on the runway, but because I was a little bit low on my altitude, I ended up drifting off to the west of the runway a little bit. It's all open grassy area, but the grass is pretty high, and I was concerned about tripping and falling, so I took 2 steps on the landing and then ended up setting down, unfortunately. So no damage, no breakage, but it was not what I had planned. I didn't run it out correctly and turn around and set the wing down like I'd like to.
Thank you.
So my friend Jack accompanied me to the field along with my wife and my dog, and they watched me fly. And on the ride back, Jack and I started a discussion. Now, this is a discussion between 2 career-long pilots about the aerodynamics of paragliders. And there's some fuzzy science out there, folks. So if you're transitioning to this from general aviation, you're going to have to get your head around some really bizarre concepts. And well, let me put it to you this way. In 42 days, I earned a type rating on one of the most advanced transport category airplanes ever built, the Boeing 777. And I've been studying this paraglider phenomenon for 100 days now, 120 days. And I'm just scratching the surface of how much I don't know. So one of the things that Jack and I discussed on the ride home was the aerodynamic forces that actually affect a paraglider in flight and what controls it. You know, this is what our conversation boiled down to. In a general aviation airplane, the wing creates lift, and the byproduct of lift is drag. So if it's a USA 35B wing on your Piper Cub, what balances and keeps that wing aimed into the atmosphere at the correct angle of attack and desired direction of the pilot is the tail surfaces of the airplane. The horizontal stabilizer, the rudder, the vertical stabilizer, the elevator, and the trim tabs associated with those control surfaces that give you the ability to adjust and maneuver that wing into the wind. Well, in a paraglider, all of that need for drag at the tail end surface of the wing itself is all built into the span or the chord width of the glider itself. So the drag to keep the glider aimed into the wind at the optimal angle of attack that's determined by the manufacturer is the drag within the wing itself. Our conversation was pretty interesting. Jack's a certified flight instructor. In fact, he does flight instructor renewal courses for other flight instructors with the full blessing of the Federal Aviation Administration. So where I really lost Jack was when we started talking about the forces of flight that affect general aviation airplanes and how they affect paramotors as well, only differently. The P factor, the acceleration forces, gyroscopic precession, the asymmetric thrust of the propeller. And when I explained to him that those forces affect just the pilot on a paraglider, independent of the wing itself, which can never happen on a general aviation airplane because the wing and the motor are bolted to the same airframe. Jack actually told me that his head hurt. So I briefly engaged Mr. Shanzi in some discussion about the aerodynamics that affect paragliders, and he says he's not buying the he refers to the reflex wings as a hoax. Well, I own a reflex wing, and hoax or not, it's got me safely off the ground and back to the earth 3 times. And I'm not so sure that I understand Del Shanzi's objection to the reflex technology. It seems to be pretty pervasive in the paraglider world. I've seen it initially in experimental home-built aircraft and some more advanced production airplanes like the Cessna Corvallis that use reflex wing technology, where the trailing edge of the wing actually curves back up a little bit, so that the front of the wing's camber is here, and then the trailing edge is actually allowed to come back up, and it allows for more even reattachment of laminar flow as the air joins at the trailing edge of the wing. Faster, more stable. I'm not so sure that I understand what Dell's objections are. Although he is selling Dominators. So the last time that I'd flown prior to this video's documenting, the winds were perfectly calm, and I ran as fast as I physically could. And as I accelerated through running, there was a portion of time where I couldn't run any faster. I didn't want to stop because I knew that stopping meant I wasn't going flying. I didn't think there was enough lift in the wing to get me airborne yet, and I actually had a fraction of a second where I thought, I'm going to stop, I'm not going to be able to fly, and I'm going to get hurt. This prop's pushing behind me. I was almost to the point of tripping and stumbling. I couldn't physically run any faster. And I eased off of the throttle a little bit, and I thought I'll add in a little bit of brakes to begin my attempt to stop, and the wing immediately generated enough lift to pull me off the ground, and I came back on the power, and away that I went. So my objective last night was to close that gap so that I either pulled brakes earlier or used some headwind, which ultimately I had, and close that gap between as fast as I can run and flying, where the fear of getting injured or hurt, that time frame. And last night there was no overlap there. I went from running, I could have continued to run faster, and the brake application was just about right to get me airborne, and I still had plenty of room to run and continue to accelerate. So my takeoff was relatively reassuring that I can do this now without fear of running out of foot speed. And one way to do it is with the headwinds. And this is an example of the headwinds here. This worked out pretty good.
And if he cuts it, I don't want him to glide into the trees over there.
I think
this is it.
I don't know what glide ratio means, but I know once he cuts it, it's over pretty
Done.
quick. Yeah.
Also, and the landing was a confidence building maneuver also, even though I sat down with just a little bit of headwind. The speed and the velocity and the momentum over the ground is significantly reduced. So I'm going to try to make an effort to fly more when there's 5 to 7 knots of wind, which is a pretty narrow window. We either get dead calm days here or seems to be